So yeah, and when I arrived in Ukraine, I spent a week in Kiev. Then I went to Donetsk, and one of the first person I met there was Patrick. It's at first I was like, it was really the first job I did as a journalist, and I was going there completely freelance with like a good knowledge of the current situation and the risks that were involved. And when I arrived, the situation was rather calm in some ways, or more peaceful than what it became during the first week I was there. By that I mean the public buildings were seized by it wasn't separatists back then. Like the way of calling them is a bit difficult, because yeah, sure, there was like a pro-Russian desire to be closer to Russia than to be closer to Europe, but it would be kind of hard to like really define and like put a proper specific name on it at the very beginning. But yeah, during that week, I'm going to use the word separatist for now, and I don't know if it's the best one, but like seized as also the airport of Donetsk. And from there, the Ukrainian army gave them an ultimatum to either leave the airport or they would start a military operation to retake it. And from there, the conflict like really kicked off. But I would really like to point to something like the intensity of the conflict has been really localized. By that I mean like there have been few places where there've been like intense fighting, like for example the airport in Donetsk, Kramatorsk, Debeslevo, and a few other cities like that have been like really affected by the shellings and the fightings. But when we were going back 5 kilometers away from the front line, especially on the side from the controlled by the Ukrainian government, just by walking there, it would have been like, it's not noticeable this place was at war when being on the ground. Like it's what's really like the military was really deployed on the line. On the separatist side, it was more, well, people wearing random uniform, and it was more visible. You could more feel the tension of the situation. But yeah, it's the conflict in Ukraine is not the war in Iraq, in Afghanistan, or Syria, or what happened in between Armenia and Azerbaijan not that long ago. And it's not to diminish the intensity and like the devastation it brought, but I think it's really important to take in consideration that it's not been an all-out war, and in some ways I would consider it like a low intensity fighting, because it didn't spread across all the border, or even days. Oh yeah, just came to my mind, like if you followed a bit this conflict, the Ukrainian government often and kind of always used the word terrorist or anti-terrorist operation for its operation in Eastern Europe, Eastern Ukraine. But for me, this term doesn't make any sense in the way that the separatists never did any terrorist attack, at least what we would call terrorist attack in Europe. There was no attack in Kiev during all that time, the worst of the fighting in 2014, 2015. Kiev was fine. Kiev, like it was just a normal city. Sure, you would see more soldiers because people were going through Kiev to then join the Donbass. But apart from that, life was still going on. And it didn't felt like a country at war per se. Like people were talking about it, people were like feeling it, but it wasn't an all-out war. And that's kind of amusing to me to see today government asking their citizens to leave Ukraine, or the US government destroying its, saying it destroyed all its IT equipment from the embassy and moving to Lviv. Because like none of that ever happened in 2014. And I would say if Russia would have invaded half of Ukraine or all of Ukraine, today it doesn't make any sense. There is no reason for Russia to intervene now in Ukraine. Back in 2014, there was that question around its military bases, the division that existed, like that was profound in Ukraine between Ukrainian-speaking population and Russian-speaking population, which is pretty much you take the country, you slice it in half, and you take the southern coast, and all the southern coast and east of the country, it's Russian speaking pretty much exclusively, and the western part of the country speak Ukrainian. And in between, people who speak both, or not always fully, but sometimes they do. And that division was also present, like visible during the elections. And so there was a party which was closer to Russia, and all the eastern part of the country was voting for this candidate, and the western part of the country was voting. Yeah, thank you for the map. Was voting for the candidate which was more closer to Western Europe. And in some way, the annexion of Crimea and the conflict in Donbass kind of made Ukraine a country, like make all of its citizens the feeling of belonging to to a country and have a sense of unity past the barrier language. That probably wouldn't have happened without the conflict. And I personally believe that the Russian government, when I say Russia, understand the Russian government, because the Russian government and the Russian people are two different things. Like in every single country, there's a net difference between the goals of government and the goals of its citizens. And in some way, like the Russian government might have been hoping for stronger uprising across all the Russian population, or Russian-speaking population in Ukraine, which didn't quite happen. It was mainly in Odessa and then Donetsk, Lugansk Oblast. And Russia wasn't prepared to send troops and didn't want to send troops, like formally send troops in Ukraine to fight this war. And for me, the turning point that pushed Russia to intervene without saying they were underground was around the time the Malaysian airline got shut down. It was at the summer of 2014, and the Ukrainian army was like really going strong at that point and taking back territory at a really fast pace. It even split the territory controlled by the separatists between Donetsk and Lugansk territories. And at that time, I talked with person who was around my age, so early 20s, who I suspect was dealing drugs before the conflict, and now had moved to like dealing weapons. And he was telling me that at that point, if Russia didn't intervene, they were done because they didn't have enough people willing to take up arms and to go fight against the Ukrainian army. And shortly after that, a column of tanks crossed the border at a point where the separatists have not been controlling any territory. So it was the little patch of land in between. Do you have a map with the cities with Mariupol showing? Or I can find one if it's needed. Yeah. So when you're looking at Donetsk, there's and going back just a little bit south, straight south of Donetsk, there's just on the coast, it's not showing, but a tiny bit more right, a bit higher. Yeah. So Mariupol is around here, and a column tank crossed the border from like the southern part of the border in the direction of Mariupol, and they got fired at by artillery from the Ukrainian army. The soldiers inside the tanks, after they got captured, said they believed they were on an exercise and didn't know they crossed into Ukraine. After it was those information were were made public from the interview that was conducted after they got captured. So take it as you will, like what was asked for them to say by the Ukrainian, or if it was really the case. I don't know. But from what they were saying, like they didn't realize it wasn't a live fire exercise, and they were like really in Ukraine when some of the tanks got destroyed, and from there they made themselves prisoner to the Ukrainians. But at that point, with other journalists that were on Donetsk, we saw it as a sign of the Russian army that was about to intervene and was testing the defenses and seeing the reaction of the Ukrainian army. And
Mr. Antoine, excuse me, if it's okay, if we can just wrap up in like 30 seconds to a minute, and then we're going to go ahead to Patrick, and then we'll go ahead and revisit that again.
And from that point, like they really pushed back, and all of a sudden, the Ukrainian army got overwhelmed because the line got stretched out, and they lost all the territory they gained, and it kind of went back to the same lines, the same territory the separatists were controlling before that. And for me, like this, if Russia would have intervened in Ukraine more, it would have been at that point. And they intervened at that moment because they was afraid of the Ukrainian army to get more confident by their ability of taking back the Donbass and then moving their troops towards Crimea, which would have been way more problematic for Russia. The main goal, I think, for Russia was to keep its military bases in Crimea, and the rest was a distraction in some ways to protect his interest. And he didn't have any real goal to integrate the eastern part of Ukraine. If it did happen on its own, great, but otherwise they didn't have I don't believe they had the will of going to war for it. And now those last few weeks, past month of this escalation of like diplomatic escalation, I would say, because it's not the first time Russia is doing military exercise on the border, and it won't be the last, I believe. Is, I think, mostly serving personal interest, political interests from like for the US would be more, I think, to mark a profound difference with the previous administration of being stronger against Putin. For the UK, well, for changing the subject about all the issues that are actually going on with the 10 Downing Street and Boris Johnson. And Russia is also has a lot to gain from this current situation, because now nobody is talking anymore, like barely anybody is talking anymore about its persecution of political opponents. The fact that not Zelensky, Navalny is now, the Navalny organization is now considered as a terrorist organization, and they're trying to extend his jail time by 15 years.
Mr. Anton, excuse me, if it's okay, and at this point,
that was what I wanted to end with. It's like, though this current situation is like helping people change a bit the subject, and I believe it's just gonna end with every actors from the political actors being like, yeah, we won. From Russia, it's gonna be like, we made NATO back off from Ukraine. From the EU, it's like, oh, we managed to speak with Russia. From the US, it's going to be, we managed to make Russia back off and pull back its troops. And everybody is like living with a good image towards its people without going to war.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mr. Antoine.
You're welcome.
Mr. Patrick, please.
Yeah, hi everybody. I think I'm not so much going to go through the whole conflict. Antoine really put a lot of good information out there. I'm going to right now kind of talk about where I am and how I got here and what I've seen through the war. Right now I'm standing in the center of Donetsk. This is called Lenin Square, which right now we're about 5 miles away from the actual front line of the war, where the fighting does go on. Right now, everything's a bit calm because of the political situation and the rhetoric going back and forth. But for the last 8 years, from 5 miles from where I'm standing has been an active front line. And that's what I do here. I have been in this city and the surrounding areas for pretty much the vast majority of the war. Like Anton said, we first met in 2014, and I've stayed here most of the time, showing what the results of attacks have been on the civilian population here. Because I'm on this side of the front line doing my reports for so long, it wasn't so much possible to go to show information on both sides of the front line. But this is the capital of one of the 2 republics that broke away from Ukraine in 2014, following the referendum that was held by the ethnic Russians here, the ones that speak Russian. On this whole side of the country, like Anton pointed out, because, as he said, there's nobody that speaks Ukrainian here. This is Russian, ethnically Russian people, families. And when the Maidan revolution happened, if you want to call it that, and President Yanukovych was removed from office after being more leaning towards the Russian agreement. the local population said they felt that their removed from office. And for me, spending 8 years here talking to the people, what I understand from them is they felt like the Ukraine that they knew and loved before 2014 was dead. And they saw the new government after Yanukovych was removed, wanting to push towards the West and more towards NATO, and to the point of trying to remove as official holidays some of the biggest Russian holidays today, and removing the Russian language being taught in schools would just be like a slap in the face to people here. So they had the referendum to vote to break away from Ukraine, like Crimea did. I was also in Crimea during the referendum in March 2014 when they had their referendum, and I covered that as well. That was actually my first time being a journalist covering a story like this. And after Crimea, I moved to Donetsk because I saw the differences in what was being shown in the Western mainstream media, how it was a lot different than what I was really seeing with my own eyes. Like in Crimea, I saw in the West media, they were trying to portray it as this big annexation by Russia of Crimea. Well, when in fact, the population of Crimea was truly and is truly happy that they were able to become Russia again, because any elderly person that was born before 1956 was born in Russia. If they were born in Crimea, they were born in Russia. Crimea has not been Ukraine for in the grand scheme of things, a long time. And the population was happy to become part of Russia again. And when the people here in Donbass and Donetsk, Lugansk saw that Crimea was able to become part of Russia, in my experience here, learning from the people, they felt they had a chance to become part of Russia as well. So they had their referendum, they created their borders, and then this 8-year war started. And as Anton pointed out, the Donetsk airport was really the matchbox that was the heat of the battle, and it just went off after that. After the separatists or protesters, the people that just wanted to have their country here, that voted to have their country, took the airport. Ukraine warned them, and then made a move to take the airport back. And for a long time, the airport itself was half controlled by the Donetsk People's Republic forces, or the anti-government forces, or separatists, or whatever you want to call them. And the other side controlled by Ukraine forces. I was in the terminal several times reporting and showing what I could from the anti-Ukraine government side. And I've been here on the ground for 8 years showing the sometimes daily shelling of civilian areas. That's what the West doesn't understand when they're supplying these weapons to Ukraine. That a lot of these weapons end up landing in the living room of civilian homes. And it's a shame that this happened. Now, again, I'm not on the other side of the contact line, so I can't report on what's happening over there. That's what other journalists need to be doing on the other side. I only show what I see with my own eyes on this side. And for 8 years, I've shown thousands of families who have lost everything by clearly indiscriminate or targeted attacks on civilian infrastructure and homes. And the local population here accuses Ukraine of being a terrorist, as Ukraine accuses the Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic of being terrorists, as Anton said. So it's definitely been a very hard time for the people here in Donetsk. And every time I go to one of these locations where some family has lost their homes and all their belongings, I ask them what they want. And the vast majority right away say, we want peace. And I ask them, how is that going to happen? Sometimes they say, people, the powers need to talk and talk it out. Others say talking doesn't do it, only fighting does it, and they ask for Russia to come in to stop the war. And every year, this same type of thing, as Anton points out, Russia does the exercises on the border. It intensifies the political rhetoric going back and forth between the world powers, and we get close to an escalation, and then sometimes it actually escalates, like in 2017 or 2015, when the fighting did get a lot heavier. But the truth is, the front line has not changed hardly at all in the last 7 years, and nothing is happening to stop this war. And the Minsk agreements, which are in place to bring peace, haven't been working. The population here accuses Ukraine of breaking it on a daily basis, and I can confirm that in my reports. It's hard. It seems like someone really needs to step in. And I can say the local population here has been begging for Russia to step in and stop this war. And in fact, yesterday, the Russian Duma, the deputies in Russia, lawmakers, voted and recommended to the president of Russia for the republics to be recognized by Russia. And right now, the document is in Putin's hands to decide himself whether Russia is going to recognize the republics as independent states. And if that happens, then by the law of Russia, the leaders of the republics can request help from Russia, and since they would be recognized as independent from Ukraine, Russia could have the ability to send in peacekeepers. And that's what the local population wants, because they know if that happens, then the borders of the republics will be strengthened and it'll stop the war. Whether that's going to happen, there's really no way to tell. There's been some comments coming from the Kremlin today that don't look very good, because there's comments that it goes against the Minsk agreements, which the Kremlin says still has a chance to stop the war, but who knows what's really going to happen. But now that Russia has been saying they're removing more and more troops from the borders, NATO saying they're not removing the troops, hopefully today is the beginning of the de-escalation of this political nightmare right now, and hopefully peace comes to this region soon. Maybe we can take some questions if anybody has any.
Yeah, really nice, Patrick. Really nice job there, and Anton as well. Both of you guys did amazing.
I just wanted to add a little thing that's like Patrick mentioned briefly, and I think is like really important to remember, is the fact that shelling has been happening daily since the beginning of the war, and it never really stopped. Even though it's, as from my point of view, as I said before, like a low intensity war, there's still been people dying every week since the beginning of the war. Not by big numbers, but people getting killed. There's still people getting killed. And so the war, saying the war is about to start is kind of false, because the war has never really stopped. And I think that's important to remember that when we talk about the situation in Ukraine.
Very good. Thank you, Anton. Nicole, please.
Yes, hi. Thank you both so much. This has been incredibly informative. Patrick, if you can you tell if this is, maybe by the people, if this is more about being taken in by Russia, as you said, to have a protected border, or do you think this is possibly more about the oil and gas situation? Do you know?
Well, like I said, the local population here is ethnically Russian. They have been, not just since 2014, but before that, trying to push more closer to Russia. And it's really about just going to their home. I mean, they want to be part of Russia with or without gas and oil, is my experience.
So, and you don't have any sense, I know you said you're not on the Russian side, but you don't have any sense on whether they feel like this has anything more to do with one of those topics. In other words, the people on the ground there, do they really have a sense of what is perpetrating this and why this, why this is coming to a head now?
You're talking about the escalation and the political escalation currently.
Correct.
Well, for the local population here, they, like I said, they're tired of war over these 8 years. I mean, all they have to say is that it's in control, whether peace or not, it's in control of the political powers, the politicians. I mean, their main thing is just wanting peace, and none of the political stuff really matters to the local population here. The two things they want is peace and to be with Russia.
Okay, great. Thanks, Patrick. Stephanie, please.
Thank you for speaking today. You guys taking your time. I have a couple of questions kind of that can go for either one of you. And but Antoine, you said it makes no sense today for Russia to invade Ukraine. And as we know, this is a political escalation, like Patrick said. But it really is more than just about Ukraine, is it not? Isn't it more about the fact of Russian containment or NATO containment on the larger whole? Because we have a whole host of border countries besides Ukraine that everybody sees as weak and able to be expanded on either by NATO or by Russia. And the Baltics, Hungary is also one of them, along with Ukraine and Belarus. And so I wonder, and I know that Russia probably sees that as a NATO threat, much like NATO sees it as a Russian threat, or West sees it as a Russian threat. What do either of you guys think is the answer to coming up with a solution that, like Antoine said, everybody walks away with their heads held high and that they gain strength? We now know that Russia has brought their issues to the forefront with this political escalation and with their troops. So we know that they now have more of a say on the international arena. But from your guys' perspective, what do you think is the answer to where it becomes a good solution on both sides without war?
Well, if I may start, from the international perspective, which rarely ever take into consideration the people actually living there. It's both like on the Western side, I don't see any way in which Ukraine would join the EU in the foreseeable future, and even less NATO. We just need to look at the situation in Georgia, which in 2008, the president Saakashvili, who tried to regain control of South Ossetia, was met by a reaction of Moscow, and who sent troops there and completely crushed the military forces of Georgia. And since then, the question of the accession of Georgia to NATO has been a standstill, because the country doesn't control all of its official territory. And it's the same situation for Ukraine. And NATO has absolutely no interest in gaining those countries. For them, it's interesting to have them within their sphere of influence, but they don't really want them. And it's the same for the EU. The current situation of the EU, it has already enough issues within the EU with problems of cohesions between the different countries with Brexit that happened not that just a few years ago, the issues with corruption in Eastern Europe, and Ukraine is like they're using kind of the carrots of being, hey, you can join Europe, but you're not really going to join us because we're not really that interested in it. But we're going to take advantage of the situation for our own interest. Russia is also doing the same, in the sense that it has its, or at least had, because now its financial interest in Ukraine are way more limited than it was before 2014, of keeping this Ukraine in its sphere of influence. And always that view from both sides of trying to keep it all for itself and not reaching an agreement and being, yeah, you can have different partners and stand in the middle, which Ukraine have been trying to do since independence. It like tried really hard to stay neutral and take benefits and have good relations with Russia and with the US, with the EU, when it came to that bad ending, which is not an end right now, but yeah. So if Patrick wants to add anything.
Well, I think you kind of summarized it pretty well. In more of a shortened format, and the way the people here feel, and the Russians that I've met, is they just want the West to stop supplying Ukraine with, as they call it, lethal aid against the ethnic Russian separatists or anti-government forces here. I think if the West stops helping Ukraine to defeat the breakaway areas, then Russia definitely won't force in to secure the borders here, because there would be no need. And it seems like there's only two ways to end this war, is for Russia to come in and strengthen the borders here after it's recognized the republics as their own countries, or just many, many years of almost this frozen conflict we're in with the, as you said, just a few people getting killed every week, which is horrible, but that's just the way I see it.
Very good. Thank you. Mr. Drew, go ahead.
All right, thank you. Thank you to both of you guys. I cannot help but draw some parallels, again, not to draw moral equivalency in this conflict versus the one in Syria, but I am seeing some parallels between this conflict and the de-ISIS campaign in Syria, which led the US down a path of fighting a somewhat proxy war against Russian paramilitary groups such as Wagner, and then also Russian military technology and their jamming effectiveness against the US. So my question really is for Patrick. You've mentioned lethal aid. There's a poorly defined victory on part of the Russians. Is this an ethnocentric versus a geopolitical or geostrategic war? What, in your opinion, is the proverbial red line? We saw that drawn in Syria that got the United States and its lethal aid packages flowing. And then we also saw the very highly contested fight against the United States Air Force and our ground soft forces against the PMCs. Do you see a red line in this Ukrainian conflict?
A red line as in what will bring the United States and NATO into more of an active role in this conflict?
Yes.
Well, considering Biden said there's no way that U.S. forces are going to be active here, I think that red line it has to be a really far line, because if NATO and or the United States forces get involved directly with this conflict here, I mean, we're talking about there's no way to go back. I mean, that's heading directly to a war between the United States and Russia. So that line, I would hope, could never be reached. Even if Russia tomorrow was going to move in totally, they would be, as General Miley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said a few days ago, Russia would be in Kiev in 72 hours. And with so many countries evacuating their instructors from Ukraine, that red line is never going to happen here. I don't think the NATO would have any choice but to let Russia take Ukraine up to Kiev. Maybe not all of it, but definitely to the Dnipropetrovsk River.
Very good, thank you. Ms. Sparkle, go ahead. Sparkle?
Yes, hello. Recently, Ukraine has declared a day of unity. What does that signify? Is that signify something, a sense of patriotism and a message to the people there? What are your both thoughts on that?
Maybe that's a good question for Anton, I think.
Well, it's more, I wouldn't put too much behind it, honestly. It's political speeches and trying to make people feel more united, but I don't think it has a huge influence on the actual situation, like what happened over the course of the last 8 years. Like, that's what really made the feeling, I think, of unity within Ukraine. If we don't, well, Ukraine without the parts controlled by the DNR and LNR, and it's, yeah, for me, like those events are kind of empty, if I may say. Like, it's not something that has a real influence on the current situation.
Thank you, Anton. Mr. Samuel, please.
I would like to say thank you to you guys for hosting this. It's really important to understand the situation, not from the media point of view, but to actually know what's going on down there. My question is, how can this conflict between Russia and Ukraine, if isolated, can impact the entire world? And what you guys input into what may have come of the United States if Russia get that move into Ukraine? Those are my two questions.
You first, Patrick.
So I'm not sure if I fully followed the question. Your second question was, how could it affect the United States and the rest of the world if Russia and the United States get into it? Or can you repeat the question?
So how could that impact us as a world and the United States if Russia continue that move to Ukraine? And what would that mean for us?
Well, I think if let's say, for example, if tomorrow Russia decided it's going to do the big bad Russian invasion like the Western powers have been saying it's going to do, which I seriously doubt. But as I said before, it's going to be hard to reach that line where NATO is going to move on Russia. I don't think it'll come. So it will severely affect Russia, because they're going to be packed with sanctions and the Russian economy will definitely take a big hit, and that will ripple through the world. But I think it'll definitely affect Ukraine, but maybe Anton can have a little bit more broader view of the effects.
Well, I think like on the large scale of things, it's outside of Russia and Ukraine, and I would say the Russian sphere of influence, and also further down the line for China and Taiwan, it wouldn't change anything. And they would just let it happen, because that's pretty much what they said. They removed all the personnel and said that if Russia invades, we're not going to do anything about doing sanctions, which I think is kind of ironic, because the type of sanction they've been doing this far are sanctions that damage the economy, but affecting more Russian people rather than the oligarchs or the Russian government, the persons at the top of the Russian government. So it's really, I would be more concerned, yeah, as an after effect of what could happen in Asia with China, and seeing that you can just go in there and nothing's gonna happen, which kind of already happened with the annexion of Crimea. And it's the sanction have been put in place. The people who suffered from it were Russian citizens, not the oligarchs. The few got their asset frozen. Like, it wasn't that big of a deal for them. Like, they've seen worse. You go back 30 years, they had nothing, and now they're billionaires. So losing a few millions is not that big of a deal for them. And yeah, Russia have been reintegrated progressively over the last few years in political, like international political meetings and all that kind of stuff. So it's really, I don't see it's just kind of going in nowhere. Like, it doesn't make sense if, well, yeah, I just don't see it happening. I don't see Russia invading Ukraine. For me, it doesn't make sense now for Russia to do it. And earlier, just a thought crossed my mind when one of you mentioned the military personnel training the Ukrainian forces who withdrew from Ukraine. And it made me think of the current negotiation that's going on between NATO and Russia. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's one of the requests from Russia that all military personnel from NATO leave the country and stop training Ukrainian personnel. And it's just a game of trading, but I really don't see how it's gonna go worse. And to answer to Grace, also, who posted a message in the chat, I don't think it would go in a tribal discord, because it's not as divided. Like, Ukrainian speakers and Russian speakers within Ukraine, or even between Ukraine and Russia, they still see the people as people with whom they share an history. They see the governments as issues, the militaries as issues, but I don't believe they're going to be ethnic fighting like we might have seen in the Middle East or within the ex-Yugoslavia. Otherwise, I think like massacre would have happened in 2014, 2015, which it did not. So I don't see any reason why it would change now, when people on the ground are being really exhausted by the war and everything they want is just it to end.
That's great. Thank you so much for taking Grace's question. Mr. David, go ahead.
I realize we're really short on time. I have kind of a tactical question. We're getting big reports. I work in cybersecurity of denial of service attacks against the MOD and the banks, and a bunch of SMS kind of misinformation or information, depending on your perspective, that's going on. Do you see both sides doing that? And what's the actual impact? Either of you.
Well, recently I can't talk about what's been happening, like in that kind of disinformation that might have happened for the Donetsk side. So maybe Patrick could answer that that question.
You're referring to the cyber attacks more off that happened in Kiev this morning, correct? Am I following the question correct?
ATMs went down, banks went down, and Ministry of Defense websites went down. But then we're getting conflicting reports that, in fact, that was a disinformation campaign.
Yeah, it's hard to say what's false information comes out now from where, because it's really hard to say. But I heard that there were attacks in Kiev as well, and the two biggest banks in Ukraine did go down, as long as with the Department of Defense. But I'm not in Kiev, and I like to keep what I do, especially in my reports, up to what I see with my own eyes. So it's kind of hard for me to comment on what's going on there.
Yeah, me, what I wanted to say, like, because now I see what you're asking, David. What I wanted to pass on to Patrick was more the part of text messages being sent to the population, which happened during 2014, 2015 from both sides. And the Ukrainian government in 2014 still had some form of control over the network infrastructure, which allowed them to capture a lot of communication, which we often overestimate the technical knowledge of the people on the ground who are fighting, because lots of the communication were just happening through regular phone calls, and there was no system put in place to have secure communication that is like between the separatist forces or even within the Ukrainian army. The signals were being intercepted like really easily on both sides. Now it kind of changed, like because I've worked on really like the cyber space aspect of things in Ukraine, and the network have been completely rerouted to the separatist region through Russia. It took a really long time. For Crimea, for example, it only started after the bridge between Crimea and the mainland of Russia was completed. And at first, the internet cable was pulled, was primarily for the military forces. And they only started to develop it once the Ukrainian activists blew up some power lines that were delivering power to Crimea, and also shut down the internet. And from there, Russia was kind of forced to completely redesign the network infrastructure to be able to provide stable internet and electricity in Crimea. And
excuse me, Anton, can I cut you off just for 1 second?
Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to make a point that my telephone battery is about out. So if I lose you guys, it was great being here. I'll stay with you as long as I can.
Patrick, thank you so much. Stephanie, did you have a question for Patrick?
You can go for either one. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Antoine, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
Oh, it's okay. But
okay,
just David, if you want to talk some more about this aspect of the cyber situation, we could chat more like privately if you want.
Oh, that'd be
Because there's a
fantastic.
lot of
Thank you so
things to
much.
say.
Very good. Very good. Okay, Miss Stephanie, please.
Just one more follow-up question. For years, analysts have said that Russia, the biggest threat of Russia is revealing NATO's weaknesses and disunity. And I think one of you said, maybe it was Patrick, you said NATO will have to let Russia take significant part of Ukraine. Up until right now, today, at this moment, has Russia successfully shown NATO's weakness and disunity with this escalation, or do they need to invade in order to actually prove this weakness that people have been saying for years and years? What's your thought?
I personally don't. I don't know how much of a weakness Russia has shown in NATO. I mean, they both go back and forth trying to show each other's weakness, but Russia is making a point that they're not going, or they don't want NATO to move in their backyard or on their porch, as Vladimir Putin said yesterday in his press conference. He said he accused NATO of trying to move onto Russia's front porch. And he said, what would the United States do if Russia tried to move on their front porch and tried to put something, missiles, as he put it, in Mexico or Canada? So both sides are making points. Whether they're really revealing weaknesses, it's not my place to say, but that's just the facts of what he is saying yesterday.
Mr. Anton?
Yeah, well, in some ways, I would say like the weakness of NATO, or at least in the current situation, is that it involves the role of NATO in protecting other countries that are not part of NATO. So it's something that when NATO was made, I don't believe it was the goal of NATO. NATO was just an alliance between countries to defend themselves, not defend other countries. And when the question is to defend other countries or foreign nations in one way or another, offensive, like it might have been in Afghanistan, or in a defensive role, if we may say, for Ukraine, it's really like the interest of each country is different. If the attack was against Baltic states that are part of NATO, then NATO was made for this. Okay. And everyone who signed up in NATO was like with this in mind, to protect each other. But they didn't join per se to protect countries that are not part of it and that didn't get accepted by everyone. So that's where like a discord like shows up, and I don't know if it's the role of NATO to protect those countries. So
very good. Okay, Antoine and Patrick, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your expertise and your experience. It was so good learning from you. For everybody that participated, thank you so much. And for your questions, we learn each time you ask a question. So to everyone, thanks so much. Patrick and Antoine, stay safe in your travels and everything, in everything you do. You guys keep up the good work. We learned so much from you guys.
Thank you
for having us.
Okay, thanks again, everyone. Really appreciate it. It was a good. Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you.
bye.
Bye.